Hi, I'm Yana.
Hi, I'm Simon.
Welcome back to Rooted in Dirt HQ.
Today we're going to be talking about super shoes in trail running.
Yes, and just to frame this discussion, this is not an introductory discussion to super shoes. If you are interested in that, Simon and Emily from Trail Culture go into that in one of her podcast episodes into great detail, and we will add the link to that podcast episode in the show notes. Instead, today, this discussion is specifically targeted at super shoes in trail running. So, Simon, what is the current evidence that we have? Do we see similar performance improvements in trail running when it comes to super shoes?
My sort of gut feeling instinct is to say no, we don't. Just off the bat, like there's not as clear evidence in trail running. I'm aware that a lot of people swear by them. You listen to a lot of Swap podcast with David Roach and Megan Roach, and he's bought how many pairs did you say of ASUs now?
27.
27 pairs of
That was at least his plan.
Agravix Speed Ultras, which have got a carbon plate in them, and sort of swears by them. I also know like Jim Walmsley, for example, when he broke the Western States course record 14:09, he ran in Hoka Tecton X2s, which have a carbon plate in them. A lot of trail runners, depending on the kind of trail race, are wearing even road shoes, with carbon plates in them. So I think there's probably a lot of people out there that would say, yes, they absolutely make a difference and there is a performance benefit. But I think it's very race dependent, course profile dependent, which we can talk about later. And I think I don't think it's as clear of an answer as it is in road running, where you can see that there typically is a benefit for most runners. Again, not all runners, but most runners see a performance benefit. I don't think it's as clear in trail running. Yeah.
So why is that? Why wouldn't it be as clear to assess whether super shoes have a performance benefit, an economy benefit in trail running than in road running?
So
you mentioned course specific.
Yes, yeah. So when it comes to road running, a lot of the early evidence, and I call it evidence, is quite a loose term, but when something new comes into the market, a new ergogenic aid, maybe think bicarb now or whatever, like the first thing that people do is they do observational research. So they just go and explore, has there been an improvement in performance times, since this thing started becoming widely used, widespread? And at the end of 2016, so that was after the Rio Olympics, was the first time that super shoes became available for competition. So 2017 is sort of this very clear transition period between pre and post super shoe introduction. And what we saw through observational research, through the likes of Wouter Hoogkamer and colleagues, there's a few other people that have done this, is they sort of looked at like world record and world leading times for each of the years before the introduction of super shoes and after the introduction of super shoes. And in your road running races, 5K, 10K, half marathon, there was evidence that would suggest that times improved by 1 to 2.5% in men more on the lower end of that spectrum, and women on the higher end of that spectrum, which is a massive performance benefit.
Yeah.
And prior to 2017, those times had been quite stable for 4 or 5 years, like the world leading times. So observationally, there was a speculation that, okay, it's the shoes that are, the thing that is causing this improvement. Now, that is quite a big assumption to make. I think it's more difficult in trail running because we know that road running at that point already was highly professionalized.
Yeah.
There's a huge sample of runners. This is something we talked about in our last episode, the professionalism of the sport, or professionalization of the sport. There's a much bigger sampling pool of young, talented athletes in road running, more people getting up to the top of that sort of performance pillar. Road runners are typically training more, have bigger contracts, bigger money, prize sponsorship, that kind of thing. and the general training is at a higher standard, let's say. So the performance gap, the ceiling between where we currently are in terms of, let's say, marathon, human performance, and what is probably a ceiling that no one will ever be able to go faster than, that performance gap is quite narrow. If you try to do the same observational kind of research in trail running, you're going to really struggle. So no one's done it, at least in the literature that I've read, tried to do something similar, since super shoes were introduced. But B, the performance gap is much larger.
Yeah.
So, for example, I just looked at Western States because I thought Western States is like pretty consistent in terms of the course profile over those periods of time. And the women's record, it's not quite the same because Courtney Dalwater broke the record in like 2023, which was a little bit later. But she improved on Ellie Greenwood's course record from like 2012, 2013 by almost 8%. Now, again, this is a 100-mile course, okay? There's an 8% improvement, which suggests that gap, that performance gap, is much larger.
Yeah.
And probably still there's more to go. But also Courtney ran in Solomon, S-Lab, Genesis, I think, which don't have a carbon plate in them anyway. So, there's not much logic in looking at that, other than to state that performance gap is quite wide.
Yeah.
And I think depending on the race course, some race courses like your local backyard race, that performance gap is going to be even wider than like an internationally renowned race where the best of the best are going to compete. So depending on course profile, depending on distance, depending on technicality, and then course conditions come in, Western States, hot years, cold years. I couldn't look at UTMB because if you go and look at like the UTMB records, the course distance is always different every year. So you can't make those comparisons. So yeah, it's much more challenging in trail running to do those kinds of observational studies and then make assumptions off of them.
Yeah. So then, by the very nature of trail running, having such varying courses and weather and all sorts of variables, how then can research help us to identify to what extent, if any, super shoes can benefit trail runners?
Yeah, so I think it's trying to distill those leaps, those increases in world leading, world record times, course record times. It's trying to distill that down to what is the impact of the shoe itself on these changes. Recently, we've had this sort of carb loading, high carb, interventions, movements, if you will. We've had these heat mitigating strategies, all of these kinds of things. And those are no doubt also having a massive effect. So it's trying to figure out what is it about a shoe that should give us the benefits if we can't distill it down very easily. And so it's trying to understand the mechanism behind what the shoe gives us, like the benefit that the shoe might give us. So if we can identify the mechanism underlying that and we can see that it exists in trail running, then we can make some assumptions that it's probably giving us a performance benefit. So the next step of road running research on these super shoes was to go and understand, okay, yes, on average for most runners we see a performance improvement. Let's try and figure out what that benefit is. So go back into the lab and assess these shoes under very controlled conditions. And what researchers have found, almost unequivocally, I mean, there are dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of research papers now on super shoes specifically. And usually they're treadmill conditions, very controlled in the lab, these sort of post-observational research studies where you've got runners running in different kinds of super shoes versus a control, like a non-super shoe, trying to match them for weight and structure of the shoe and that kind of thing, and then trying to distill down what are the physiological differences or biomechanical differences when we run in these different conditions. And pretty much across the board, and again, go back to our podcast, I mean, it doesn't apply to every single runner, but on average, I would say runners get a running economy benefit out of the super shoe. So the cost of running, depending on how you define that, might be in milliliters of oxygen consumed per minute or per kilometer or whatever the case is, the cost of running is lower in the super shoe, which means we're more efficient. The magnitude of that varies, but sort of up to about 4% is on the higher end of that benefit. And so, again, we're making a presumption that, we know that runners who are more economical are faster. We see that in the classic endurance model. And so if you're getting an economy benefit out of a shoe, you're probably getting a performance benefit out of the shoe. And so we're starting to see, we have started to see some research studies like that in a controlled laboratory setting. Solomon have done some research in this area. And, they assessed runners in super shoe and non-super shoe. Again, go back to our podcast and listen a little bit more in a bit more depth on that. But basically what they found is that these runners weren't getting, these trail runners, they were sort of recreational runners, your everyday trail runner, weren't getting that same 4% economy benefit in an uphill, 10% uphill running condition. I think they ran at around 10 or 11 Ks an hour, if I recall. On the 10%, it was about 8 Ks an hour. They also ran on level, and then they ran on uphill.
Yeah.
And they found a benefit on level, which is what we expect, but they didn't see the same benefit on uphill. And some other road running researchers have looked at a more moderate gradient, in like just around 5% or just under, and found that there was a benefit. There was that economy benefit running uphill. These are in road super shoes, unlike the Solomon study, which was in trail super shoes. They found that there was a benefit, but it was less than in level conditions. So the speculation is that sort of as the gradient gets steeper, that margin becomes narrower until where they were running at 10% and there was no benefit at all. So these are studies done under like very sort of controlled laboratory conditions. And yeah, seemingly the steeper the gradient goes, the less economy benefit we get. And then we can presume that this is why this is maybe something that means we're not going to get a performance benefit out of the shoe in technical steep trail races.
And so is there any new research that is informing our understanding of how super shoes might aid in the performance or running economy for trail runners?
Yeah, so this is why I wanted to record this podcast. It's sort of or this episode. This is something I read quite recently because I'm doing some research of my own on super shoes. And
so this is hot off the press.
Yeah, this is hot off the press. So we're doing like a super shoe study in road runners, in women road runners. But part of that writing process is like reading as much as possible on the topic and formulating your introduction, and that's sort of the phase that I'm in now. And this study popped across my library search, and it was in trail running, so it's a bit off topic, but I was like, I need to read it. So I've written it down here. It's a paper by Korb, Santamaria et al., and it was published this year in 2025 in Applied Sciences. It's actually an open access paper, so you can go and access it and read through it and let us know your thoughts. It's called The Impact of Advanced Footwear Technology on Performance and Running Biomechanics of Mountain Runners. And I wasn't aware of this paper when I recorded the podcast with Emily on trail culture. And I was, as part of this, prepping for this, I re-listened to that podcast. And right at the end, I said, well, something that we maybe need to do in trail running is, forget the economy stuff like this Solomon study did. Let's just get runners out onto the trails, put them in different shoes and see what happens. Is there a performance benefit? And sort of unbeknownst to me, this study was obviously busy going on and got published, which I think is quite cool. So in the study, they took, I think it was 12 well-trained, like experienced mountain runners. And what they did was they got 2 pairs of shoes. One was a super shoe with a carbon plate, one was not. They tried their best to match the shoes as best as possible. So the mass of the shoe was very similar and the drop was very similar. The one thing that they couldn't control is obviously the stack height, because the super shoes, the stack is always a bit higher. But as much as possible, they got two shoes that were sort of very similar in profile, except for the carbon plate in the midsole. And then what they had these runners do was they did all your VO2 max testing, and they familiarized them in the shoes and on the course as well. It's all really good practice. But then they got these 12 runners in to do a real world time trial, if you will, like a trail running time trial. It was in Spain. And the time trial involved just over 5 kilometers, so quite short, but still a lot longer than like these typical laboratory treadmill running protocols, okay, which are like a few minutes, trying to look at differences between shoes. So 5K distance, they had a very clear uphill section, so they marked it was uphill only, which was like 1.7 Ks or whatever. And that gradient, I sort of did some rough calculations, somewhere between 15 and 20%. So a bit steeper even than, other researchers have looked at before. It's like 300 meters over that distance. And then literally coming back down. So same distance, same negative gradient. And then that again had like a 1.5 to 2K sort of mixed segment, which was mostly level, but sort of had some undulations towards the end. So it's a 5K with just over 300 meters of elevation gain. They randomized the groups, so 6 of them went in the super shoe first, and then the non-super shoe regular trainer, and then the other 6 did it the opposite way around. And they had them run, and then they gave them a 30-minute recovery period, and then run again. So I mean, that's quite brutal, like 2 5K time trials with a 30-minute rest in between. Obviously, the reason they randomized that is because they saw massive fatigue effects basically between the 2 time trials. That's normal, right? And so when you randomize it, you can sort of wash out the fatigue effects when you're trying to just compare the 2 shoes. And yeah, what they found was that there was absolutely no performance benefit to wearing super shoes. The super shoe time was marginally slower than the regular shoe on average, but we're talking, I think, less than a minute, if I recall. And keep in mind the time trial was, I think it was just under 30 minutes, 25 minutes or something like that, sort of average time to complete. But they also recorded a bunch of other things. So they recorded these same time margins for the whole course, but also for the uphill, downhill, and mixed segments. And again, there were no benefits to the advanced footwear technology on any of the segments either. So it's like the whole thing plus the segments. And they didn't really specifically measure economy, but they did measure things like blood lactate concentration before and after. They measured heart rate, mean heart rate, and peak heart rate across the whole thing and between the sections. They measured the amount of watts for power that they produced on the whole thing and between the segments. And again, pretty much across the board for these sort of more physiological performance measures, there was just a consistent, no difference between the 2 shoe conditions. Where they did find some differences was in the biomechanical markers. So specifically, they found biomechanical changes that they deemed to be less favorable or not favorable in these super shoes. Okay, so the first one was that the stride frequency, how frequently they were stepping, was lower in the super shoe. Therefore, speculating here, but therefore also increasing the ground contact time. So when you're not stepping as frequently, you're in contact with the ground for longer.
Yeah.
And with it wasn't significant, but a marginally longer step length in the super shoe. There was also more vertical oscillation of the center of mass on both the uphill and downhill segments in the super shoe. Now, I'm just speculating here, but when you run in a super shoe where like your balance is a bit compromised and you're a bit worried about foot placement, and this was a trail running study, I'm guessing that you're in these shoes and you're thinking, okay, I need to maybe slightly lengthen my stride here, spend longer on the ground, make sure I've got a good contact, and then propel again. The problem with this kind of biomechanical profile is we typically see these things happen with fatigue. So this is normally a fatigue marker, reduced step frequency, longer ground contact time. We sort of typically see that as a less efficient profile. And like I said, they didn't measure economy, but that's maybe some, the next step is to put a breath by breath portable cardiopulmonary exercise test on and go and do the same study. But these are also factors that are related to increased injury risk. All right, so longer steps, less frequent steps, longer time in contact with the ground means vertical ground reaction forces and braking forces can be higher. So there's definitely a concern there around sort of injury risk. And then the last thing, the only other thing is that they did like some subjective comfort scale stuff, and the runners felt less flexibility. In general, the comfort was the same, but specifically on the flex of the shoes, they felt quite like constrained in the forefoot area around that MTP joint. Go and listen to Emily's podcast, which is again because that carbon plate is in there. So some subjective, differences there. But I think for the most part, showing that in a more technical, more real world scenario for trail runners, perhaps that performance benefit is not going to be there. And again, all of this is caveated around course profile, individual preference, those kinds of things as well. And I do get that if you're sort of, hell bent on super shoes are the way to go. Maybe you felt a personal benefit, but again, 12 runners, we haven't seen anything. So I do think there's now a growing consensus in the trail running research on super shoes that when you start to go steeper and steeper and more technical, you get less of a benefit out of the shoe. And that ultimately should dictate your choice of shoe for any given race.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think our listeners would have found that really interesting. Any take-home messages before we ask our listeners to engage with us? And because I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this. That balancing the cost involved in obtaining the super shoes in the first place, depending on the course profile, depending on the steepness of the gradients, depending on your budget, depending on the confidence levels that the super shoes might give you, depending on sort of what camp you fall into. Yeah, any last words?
Yeah, I appreciate you tolerating my long rant there, but this is just something, it's obviously very topical and something I really wanted to speak about this week. I think take-home message for me is you've got to base your shoe selection or choice on the course that you're planning to run. So I'm still thinking, for example, I'm running Arc of Attrition 40K coming up in January. I'm still thinking of running that in a super shoe because there is only 1,000 meters of elevation gain over 40 kilometers. So yes, there are some uphill sections, steep coastal path. It's arguable whether I'll be running or hiking those, but there are long sections of sort of flattish, undulating. There's sections of road on the course, and I'm trying to weigh up this whole thing of the benefit that I'll get on those very flat, fast sections, because I will be running at speeds where you should see an economy benefit, versus the risk or negative impact of potentially some of these more technical, climbing segments. It was interesting to me in the study that they found no benefit in the downhill, which I think makes sense as well, because you are braking a lot on going downhill. You're not in a typical running stride. So I think, probably the jury's still out on sort of downhill running as well, and we need to explore that a little bit more. But I would suggest if you're planning on doing a race that has got a lot of climbing and a lot of steep climbing, that you might actually be at detriment. And go and refer back to our episode with Emily, but there is evidence to suggest you're actually getting a detriment in the super shoe on uphill segments. So is that detriment that you're going to experience during your uphill going to be washed out or accounted for in all the level running, flattish running that you're going to do. If you could say, yes, I feel strongly that I will work back that, possible detriment, then go for it. But the risk of injury, that comfort risk, rolling an ankle, all of those you need to think about as well when you're running in a narrower, higher stack shoe. It's individual preference. If you really want to chat about it, drop us a DM, and we're happy to advise you based on the course you're going to try and compete.
I think one other thing that's just important to mention is when Simon says that he might, or he's probably going to run in super shoes for Arc of Attrition marathon distance, he is talking about a trail super shoe, because there is also there are many athletes that choose to run trail races in Alpha Flies, for example, and that is a whole nother conversation. But you do mean as in Vibram lugs?
Yeah, because the Arc of Attrition is technical. Despite not having a lot of elevation gain, it's a technical race. It's on coastal paths, it's steps, it's slippery, it's winter. So I want the grip. Yeah. The grip is really important. But I could totally, again, I've never run Western States, but people run it in road shoes, right? Yeah. So I could get it if you were doing a race that you felt is not technical. You're not at risk of rolling an ankle or something like that. But yeah, that's an important caveat. And also the speed that I'm running at, I think, warrants the super shoe. If I was sort of back of the pack or whatever, I might then say, well, I don't need the super shoe, but I'm trying to eke out that little performance gain. Yeah.
Yeah. What he's talking about is around 4 minutes per kilometer flat on some of the flatter sections, maybe even dipping slightly under that. All right, we did it. Team, thank you so much for indulging us. I think this is quite a long conversation, but I think it was an important one to have. We're really interested to find out what camp you sit in. What has your experience been anecdotally? What do you believe in? What gives you confidence? What suits your budgets? What questions do you have? Please feel free to engage with us on Instagram, on YouTube, wherever you can find us. We enjoy having these conversations, and we'd like for you to be part of them. Thank you.
Bye.